Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 346 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory and my guest today is Mel Ciavucco, a counsellor, trainer and writer. She works as an online integrative counsellor, specialising in eating disorders, body image, weight stigma and domestic abuse. Mel's portfolio of qualifications is impressive: a first-class honours degree in counselling and therapeutic practice, an advanced diploma in neurodiversity and eating disorders, and a Stop So COFRA one-to-one programme which focuses on compassion-focused, risk-aware, one-to-one therapy for managing sexual risk, and that will be working with perpetrators of sexual abuse. In today's conversation, Mel will be sharing her insights on a subject that sadly every therapist needs to be aware of, that of domestic abuse, which is the focus of her lecture in the Counsellor CPD library titled Domestic Abuse Awareness, and she'll be talking to us about that lecture. So with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and a very, very warm welcome to episode 346 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly. We are delighted to welcome you to our 3 stops on our journey today, starting off with that ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're delving into trauma-informed practice, and we're going to be speaking specifically about triangulation and trauma, a really important topic. Guaranteed it's coming up in your therapy room, and Rory's going to guide us through what it is and what we should look for there. We're then going to Practice Matters that Rory has beautifully teed up already, where Mel is going to be speaking about abuse awareness. And then we go into Student Services, recognizing you, your students, on your formal journey. And today we're going to be discussing why all formal counselling courses that are worth their salt have a full year where you'll be really focusing down on counselling skills. Why is that? Why is it important? And what can we learn from that? But let's start off, Rory, with that ethical, sustainable practice with the slant on trauma-informed, and speaking about triangulation and trauma. And I'd love if you could just start off and just kind of explain what is triangulation in trauma.
Thank you, Ken. A definition is when a third party is drawn into a two-person relationship to reduce tension, avoid conflict, or gain power. And I'll give you an example of that. I had a neighbour, I'm going to call her Susan. It's not a real name. And she's a young woman. And when it got to about November, and I'd say, "Hi, Susan, how are you doing?" And she'd look very anxious and very worried. And I'd say, "Are you okay?" And she'd go, "Oh, it's going to be Christmas soon." And I'd say, what's wrong with Christmas? And she'll say, "Every year it's the same thing. I have to choose whether I go to my mum's house or my dad's, because my mum and dad are separated. And if I go to my mum's house, my dad says to me, 'Oh, you don't love me anymore and you prefer your mother.' And if I go to my dad's house, my mum says, 'You don't love me anymore and you prefer your father.'" And also, the parents will send messages. They'll use her as the messenger. Tell your mother this, or tell your father that. And what happens is in Susan's case, just talking and listening to her story, it becomes very, very angst that time of year because she did it since she was a child. And what happens is that she's absolutely terrified that someone's going to shoot the messenger, that someone is going to say to her, that this is your fault. You've delivered this information. I don't like it. And she's literally torn apart. And it's no wonder she's anxious. And the reason I talked about this topic, we talked in one of the podcasts about sort of hidden trauma. And triangulation is very, very much an aspect of hidden trauma. And how it presents in the therapy room, in my experience, is someone will come in and they'll say, I feel really anxious, like Susan. And then you'll say, do you know what's causing the anxiety? And sometimes they say, no, I don't. I just feel anxious. Now, we all know that all behavior is goal-directed. We all know that if someone's feeling an anxiety, there has to be something that's driving that. And if you listen very carefully, as the sessions go on, you may find patterns where the client is saying, I'm having to carry messages to my parents, or they have a partner who's creating jealousy by involving an ex, by going and speaking to their ex and saying, you never guess what my girlfriend or wife's doing or my husband's doing. And it creates anxiety. And I think, Ken, we've got to be quite careful when we work with triangulation, where there's three people in this situation, because what we don't want to do is pull the rug from under the client. It's very easy to say, well, just put some boundaries in and just don't be used like that. But it speaks very, very closely to attachment, because the person's conditions of worth are driven by trying to navigate this very complicated triangular relationship. So it does cause trauma. And I think as we go on, I'll give you another example of how it can start in childhood and last a lifetime. And it comes up more than we think. But sometimes, unless we have a word for it and we have a vocabulary for it, it can kind of slide past us as therapists.
Yes.
We don't see it.
Beautifully introduced, Rory. Thank you for that. And during my research, I put together some points that I'm going to share to clarify my understanding with what you've shared there. So what is trauma triangulation? Triangulation is a term that we use in counselling or psychotherapy. It's a context that refers to when a person pulls a third party into a conflict or relationship dynamic, as you just kind of explained there in your example. In trauma, this often happens unconsciously. So the person, the client that we're seeing, wouldn't be consciously doing this. And it's done as a coping mechanism to manage the overwhelming feelings and protect themselves and to regain some sense of control. So that's why, as you said, it's goal-directed, or behavior is goal-directed. There's a perfect example of what the goal may be there. And it's common in families where trauma has occurred, especially where relationships feel unsafe or inconsistent. And I'm going to come back to that point in a moment, because I think that is really, really important. And then the last point, just to echo and reinforce, underline what you've just mentioned there, Rory, we wouldn't want to go pulling the rug out. Instead of dealing directly with the person, this is what's playing out here. Instead of dealing directly with the person that the conflict exists between, what is easier, the traumatized individual goes through a third person, creating a triangle dynamic. So I've got an example here, just a generic example. A child feels unsafe with one parent, perhaps due to emotional neglect or abuse, and instead of speaking directly to that parent, they try to get comfort or influence the situation by going through to the other parent or sibling. And I think everybody at some level can relate to that kind of behavior. And in this instance, the triangle keeps them safer, and I'm using air quotes on that one there, but it does reinforce an unhealthy dynamic because they're never facing up to that trauma. There's always something in between them and the trauma, but that's keeping them safe. And like you say, Rory, we don't want to pull that rug. And I'm going to self-disclose here from my own journey. I look back now after doing my counselling training and lots of personal development of my own childhood, and there was a traumatic element to my childhood, and I did exactly this. I went and I sided with my mother in a way that felt safe, and it felt right at the time, 100% right at the time. As I look back now with a I guess more informed mindset, I see how it was not serving me. It was in some ways it was unhealthy. And what has happened as a result of that is I'm now sat past all of the playing out of that with elements of regret that I didn't have the opportunity, or I didn't know that I could have the opportunity of confronting my father and saying what that impact was on me. So I was not able to go and address the cause of the trauma, and my father has passed away, so I'm no longer able to do that. But I know that I've lived it in some way, and there was great safety in it, and I didn't see it at all. And what I was doing at that time, to me, felt 100% correct, as it should be, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're talking there is, Ken, trauma bonding. Well, that speaks to trauma bonding. We know that people stay in difficult relationships because of, they're bonded by the trauma. The fear of leaving that relationship is greater than the difficulties that they're encountering within the relationship. And one of the other things it can lead to is something called parentification. Big word there. It was coined by Hooper in 2007. So, recently, a more recent idea. And I'll tell you what parentification looks like. My wife had to be the parent as a child, a parent to her parents. And what happened was that when her parents died, her grief was enormous. And it was because she felt she was losing a child as opposed to losing a parent. And I know all loss is bad, and I know people experience loss in different ways. But talking to her and listening, it became clear that what she was experiencing was the loss of children, because she'd literally had to parent them and act as a go-between. And it can be very, very difficult. And I think when we come to work with that, and work with, this trauma bonding in any aspect of therapy, what really works isn't the theory or intervention. What has a big effect, in my experience, is the relationship between the therapist and the client. Patricia Clarkson called it the reparenting element. She was a very influential psychotherapist. And reparenting is nothing more than being an adult in the room with the client, is being still, creating a healthy, boundaried relationship. What happens with that is that if the therapy goes on for a long period of time, the client can start to reintegrate themselves to have that boundary that's being demonstrated by the therapist, if that makes sense, Ken. So it really is about the therapist. And one of the things that I've noticed through the years, and I don't know if you've seen this in practice, is that clients sometimes come in and want you to do exactly what you did, Ken, and side with them against their partner. And You've got to be very, very vigilant about that, because it's very easy to hear a terrible story and the natural reaction is, that's terrible, that person's wrong. But I think a wise therapist sets a boundary on that and allows the client to explore what's going on without being pulled into it, because triangulation can jump from one relationship to another, in my experience.
Yeah, I love that you've brought that in. And I think what's really important here is when we train to become a counselor, and specifically if you are in a person-centered modality, empathy is so, so important. Being with that client and seeing it as they do. And this is why we need to do trauma training, formal trauma training, because empathy and being next to that person without challenge is not always in service of that client. It really isn't. We need to understand when it is and when it may be trauma triangulation. We need to be able to spot that, to have that sense. And as you said, Rory, all behavior is goal directed. And that's an interesting thing. What started out as being pretty much a lifesaver in a traumatic situation, which kept that person feeling safe, can turn out to be really unhealthy as that person goes through their life. And if it's been a useful tool in situation A, it is very often seen to be a useful tool in B, C, D, right up to Z and all other situations. And we may see it playing out again and again in different situations. So we've got, let me find it here. I've got some examples of what you might see. So for example, you might see a person in a workplace that has got a challenge with maybe a manager or somebody else within the workplace. But instead of facing that situation, they would rather go to other colleagues and confide in them and say, oh, isn't it terrible that this is happening and it's making me feel like this? And they will feel safety and a belonging, and it's us against them situation. But what happens in that situation is that person is not, I guess if we look to transaction analysis, not acting from an adult state. They're acting maybe from a child state of, oh, that's not fair, and pointing out. An adult would go in and say, look, I'm not happy with this that is playing out, and face the situation head on. And I think that it impacts that. And the impact of it is it leads to mistrust, confusion, instability within relationships, and it really does prevent honest connection and healing. So that is kind of where it acts as a wedge, I guess, that we might see, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no better wedge than in abusive relationships. There's a term called a flying monkey, and it's not a monkey with wings. What it is when someone uses a third party to transmit information in a relationship that's breaking. So I'll give you another example of that. Another acquaintance of mine getting divorced. It was a pretty messy divorce. And what happened was that one day there was a knock on the door. My acquaintance opened the door, and it was an employee of her husband. Okay, so let that sink in. It wasn't a husband. It was an employee of a husband. And the employee said, I've come to give you a message from your husband. And this is the message. And they transmitted the message, gave the message. And my acquaintance said, I'm not listening to you. You go and tell my husband, if he wants to speak to me, he can knock on my door and speak to me directly. And it got into a bit of conflict because this person's saying, oh, well, no, I've been told I've got to give you this message. And, this happens a lot. And in terms of narcissistic relationships, this is sometimes called a flying monkey. Someone who's got a very narcissistic presentation will send somebody to relay information or spread rumors. And it's seen a lot. And I'm sure there's a lot of people, a lot of listening to this saying, oh, this happened in my therapy room. I was told this by a client this week. And as I say, that is a classic example of triangulation, as you said, where someone would rather badmouth someone or speak not directly to the person involved. And we need to be really, really aware of it, because it can be very traumatizing. If it starts in childhood, it can carry trauma through the years. And as we know, trauma just isn't in the mind, it's in the body as well. A lot of
yes.
people with things like fibromyalgia or ME, if you listen very carefully to them, there's usually a trauma story somewhere. Either in childhood or in the past. Because as Bessel van der Kolk famously said, the body keeps the score. It's internalized.
Indeed. Thank you for that, Rory. And we're speaking now about trauma triangulation. Now, we're going to see that same behavior that is not necessarily linked to trauma, where, you see it in everyday life where it's easier to go to somebody else and kind of speak through them and all that kind of stuff. That is a human behavior. And I think what's important here is recognizing when it's just a behavior and when it is linked to trauma. And that is the key. And that is why the formal training, trauma training, is so suggested. We don't want to misread it, where it's just a person avoiding a confrontation and it's not necessarily based in trauma. So in the therapeutic considerations that we have on this, we're looking at how triangulation might appear in therapy, and we've already mentioned it, but the client may be quoting others, and as you brought in, Rory, seeking you as the counsellor to side with them in some kind of a dispute or something that they find challenging. And it's about us as counsellors being able to gently recognize it. And it's not just when we see one kind of little bit of behavior that we go, ha, trauma triangulation. It's a set of clues that build up as we build our relationship with this client. And the work, when it is seen and recognized, is very gently and very patiently encouraging the client to access those feelings, rather than routing them through a different person. Because that's what's happening in the triangulation. In a way, we're saying, I'm going to take these uncomfortable feelings that I'm feeling over here, I'm going to put them onto another person, and I feel a bit better now. We're routing those feelings through another person. He did that, she did that, it's not fair, but I'm not going to tell them in person. I'm going to tell it to someone else and then go, oh, I feel better now. Whereas the conflict is not resolving, or the trauma is not resolvable that way. And I guess the pathways to healing within this are, for us, building safety, where that communication feels possible within the therapeutic relationship. Then, if it does show itself and we do a little bit of psychological explanation, explaining what trauma triangulation is to the client, that we do that in a way that normalizes the behavior. There's nothing wrong with them. They did exactly what was expected of them in that situation. They were protecting themselves. And in normalizing that behavior, there's the message that they weren't manipulating. It was about survival, not manipulation. And then, I guess, gradually working towards a healthier relationship pattern, exploring together with the client what they could, how they could look at this differently to kind of move from that, Rory.
Absolutely. So, as you rightly said, Ken, now that we've got a vocabulary for it, we can start to consider what we would call deliberate practice. And, this is a term that's come up a lot recently in therapy, about how we work intentionally in the therapy room, not scattered ideas and scattered interventions, but intentional work. And I think, first of all, the awareness, you notice when triangulation dynamics are being reenacted in the counselling room. And I'll give you one further example. A friend of mine who's sadly dead now, who was a brilliant therapist and one of my former colleagues that I taught with. And she had a client who came in to a therapy room, sat down, got her mobile phone out, made a phone call, gave it to the therapist and said, you tell my husband that I'm in therapy because of him. And my friend said, let's just switch the phone off. Let's just pop your phone away, and let's just have an exploration about what's going on. And that again speaks to, someone playing out a triangulation dynamic within therapy.
That's a really, I just have to jump in. That is an incredible example that you've used there, Rory.
Yeah.
That really is good. I was like thinking, what do you do? I was being that therapist, where the client just walks in and makes that call and holds it up. And what do you do? Oh my goodness. Thanks for that. Carry on.
I said that to her. I said, what did you do, Colette? And she was a very still person. And she said, I just took the phone off her, pressed the switch off key, handed it back and said, let's turn your phone off and let's just talk about what's going on here. And she didn't say anything more about that, but interestingly enough, that presence of mind and that deliberate practice, I think was very, very useful. So that led really on to what I've just explained, thinking about our boundaries and avoiding colluding, maintaining, I think, a neutral clarity in the therapy room. And it might be easy to jump in and think, I know it's psychoeducation. I'm going to teach the client what's happening. I'm going to teach them all about triangulation and abusive relationships and anxiety regulation. All correct, but it's useless without attachment repair, Ken. And attachment repair is a constant therapeutic approach. I cannot tell you how many times a client has said to me, and it's usually child clients when I was a child therapist, thing with you, Rory, is you're consistent, you're the same every time I see you. And I thought that was a bit of a throwaway comment until I went to supervision and my supervisor said, do you know what they're referring to? And I said, no. She said, you are consistently the same. You enact with them and consistently. And this isn't something they have in their outer lives. They don't know what they're going to get when they see their parents or a loved one. So attachment repair, and that isn't done quickly. That is through the arc of therapy. It takes time for someone to understand that the relationship that they're having isn't healthy, and that the therapist is enacting what is or being a healthy person in their lives in terms of attachment. And then as the arc of therapy continues, gently, as you say, not pulling the rug from people and saying, well, this is what's happening, and what you need to do is gently introducing the idea that maybe what's happening is that it's this kind of behavior of having to be everything to everybody is a way of regulating anxiety. And the thing is, most of the time it's unconscious. It's the unconscious behavior that people do. So it's bringing that edge of awareness into awareness. And if therapy continues, then in my experience as a therapist, what happens is that people will find stability and are able then to set their own boundaries and avoid being go-betweens or having to put up with the flying monkeys or my mother said this and my dad says this behavior. They become autonomous people. And hey Ken, isn't that always the journey of therapy? Isn't that the outcome that we hope, that we are autonomous people who can make our own decisions and live life on our own terms?
Wow, what a topic. I'm so grateful that you brought it today, Rory. It's an important topic, and it just reinforces the importance of formal studies in trauma-informed practice if you're working as a counsellor, really, because we see this all the time, and we touched this topic today and we've gone to some depth, but there's a huge amount of extra depth that this gets covered in. It keys into Bowen's family systems theory, attachment theory, as you've just spoken about, Rory, not narcissistic abuse and the context of that. There's so much that comes together in this. It's amazing how complex life is, I guess, for us as humans, this life journey that we take on. And I guess we get the privilege of sharing that with people along the way. If you've enjoyed this, and if you want to train as a trauma-informed therapist, go to counsellingtutor.com, click on our products. You'll see that we have an amazing trauma course there that has got some self-directed learning elements to it, but it's also got, and this is the important part, real tutor-led sessions that balance that out, so that you're not just getting the theory, you're asking the questions, you're doing that in a group peer support environment with tutors, getting the right answers, and it changes the knowledge into wisdom that can be applied in your practice. And it's counsellingtutor.com if you're interested in that. I'll leave you with these last useful phrases. Triangulation is really about safety. When somebody feels too vulnerable to speak directly, they bring in that third person. In trauma triangulation, it's not about manipulation. It is about survival. Therefore, we have to tread really carefully. You don't take away somebody's survival lifeline without really considering it and knowing exactly what you're doing and why you are doing that. And of course, our role as therapists is to help the clients recognize these patterns and find a safer and healthier way to connect and overcome the trauma or face the trauma that they are carrying. What a topic, Rory. Thank you. I really do appreciate that.
It's a big topic, and if you're listening to this and it's affected you, and we've now got a vocabulary for what some people might be experiencing. Maybe seek your own therapy. And also, if you're a member of our Facebook group, why don't you just pop some comments in? Is this something that you're aware of, or is this something that you've come across in your training, or maybe in practice? Obviously not giving client information away. If you want to know where our Facebook group is, it's Facebook Counselling Tutor, and you'll find us. Just click in, and our moderator will let you in. You could join the conversation. There's lots of conversations that goes on. Very valuable, Ken.
Indeed it is. So that is today's ethical sustainable practice. We now move right on, without skipping a beat, Rory, into practice matters. This is where we bring in experts in various topics. You meet up with them, Rory. You've already introduced Mel to us, speaking about domestic abuse awareness. And I know that there's a lecture on this that's going into the Counselling Tutor CPD library as well. So if you like this topic, you know where to go and dive a little bit deeper.
Yes, well, as with our last topic, domestic abuse is something that sadly presents in our therapy room more than we would wish, I guess. So I caught up with Mel Ciavucco, who is a domestic abuse specialist, to talk about her lecture in the CPD library. I've seen the lecture. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I caught up with her, and this is what she had to say about it.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Sadly, many practitioners will work with clients who are currently experiencing or have previously experienced domestic abuse. It's a reality that touches countless lives and brings with it layers of complexity, pain and vulnerability that we as therapists need to understand and respond to with care. Today, I'm joined by Mel Ciavucco, a counsellor, writer and trainer with over a decade of experience in mental health services, including work with perpetrators through Domestic Violence Perpetrator Programme. Mel has created a powerful CPD lecture titled Domestic Abuse Awareness. It's available now in the Counselling Tutor CPD library, and the lecture offers counsellors and psychotherapists a comprehensive overview of the different forms of abuse, including coercive control, financial and spiritual abuse, and honour-based violence. It also explores the role of power, gender, and intersecting identities in abusive dynamics. So, Mel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here. It's really exciting.
So, having looked over the lecture, it really is very, very comprehensive and something that I think every practitioner should be looking at. What inspired you to create the lecture, and how did your experience with perpetrators influence its content?
Well, I wanted to make this, I suppose a lot of people will probably say this because we didn't have much in our training and there wasn't much out there. It didn't seem to be that much out there on domestic abuse. But also when it was actually way before I trained to be a counsellor that I started doing domestic abuse trainings because I worked in mental health and they were good, no disrespect to them, but sort of samey. And I wanted to bring something different to it. And I think for me, I wanted to just impart the kind of what I'd learned along the way. Because I thought I knew about domestic abuse until I worked with perpetrators. And I didn't. I learned so much more working with perpetrators. So I wanted to do like domestic abuse awareness, but with like a twist. And I think that's what makes it different to other awareness trainings, is that it's got the perpetrator element to it as well from that perspective, but also hopefully it goes a little bit more into intersectional identities and LGBT plus domestic abuse as well. So I wanted to bring something a bit more fresh to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting because when I trained, I was a trainer for a long time and I was also a student. And one of the things that was most feared, I think, with students, and indeed some practitioners, is working with perpetrators. And I just wondered how working with perpetrators kind of informed your practice to support those people who are victims or survivors of domestic abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you just said there, it is to support victims and survivors. That's the heart of the work that we're doing, even when we're working with perpetrators, because it's almost, going to the root of the problem, really. Domestic abuse services are doing the best they can, but it's firefighting sometimes. It's just getting people out of relationships. And with domestic abuse, it's about the pattern as well. So a lot of people will go into other relationships, victims or perpetrators will go into other abusive relationships. So it's not really enough. And like I say, they're doing what they can within the means that they have. But just pulling people out of relationships didn't feel enough for me. I wanted to go and work with the people who were causing harm in various different ways. And also on where you just said that people are afraid of it, that's definitely the case. So how this started coming up for me, well, it's probably years before that I started having an interest in why people do what they do. But on my early stages of training, we were asked as a group if there's anyone that we wouldn't want to work with. And most people said perpetrators, offenders, sex offenders particularly. And it's completely understandable. But I sat there going, hang on a minute. I think these are the people that I want to work with. What's wrong with me? But I didn't get caught up in the what's wrong with me. I actually very quickly went to, this is important for me to do. I have something in me that is kind of unique then, and that's important to follow because these people really need our help. There's lots of people that need our help out there. There's lots of people that want to change their behaviours. Not everybody. Some people can't or won't or aren't in the right place for it. But out of any sort of group intervention, you'll get your dropouts, you get the people who it's kind of not so helpful for. But then for some people, it's absolutely life-changing, and that's what I saw working on a perpetrator program as well.
Yes, I think you make a very good point, and in the lecture, you do talk about the different presentations or the different behaviours that people might have that may make them perpetrators. And one of the things that struck me, and something I've known for a little while, is that neurodivergence came up. And I certainly know of someone who was in a relationship with someone who's neurodivergent, and they suffered domestic abuse, and it was about getting a program to get this person to understand what they were doing. They just didn't understand what they were doing. Some perpetrators understand very well what they're doing, but some, I think, don't. Would that be an accurate observation?
That they don't necessarily know what they're doing. Yes, I think there's definitely I think it's very genuine. Some people don't understand why they've caused harm. And it can, that I guess can be across people who are neurodivergent, neurotypical or anything. But I think sometimes not having an understanding of their own self and their own behaviours can play into it. One thing I noticed the longer I worked on the perpetrator program was the amount of people with undiagnosed ADHD or autism or late stage diagnosis, and also maybe their kids going through diagnosis, and then that's how they started questioning themselves as well. And I noticed sort of narrative with a few people where they'd actually just been kind of labelled naughty boys. It was a male perpetrator, it was men, so that's why it's quite gendered. But yeah, they had this sort of naughty boy narrative. Oh, I was just never good in school. I was just being quite stupid and just not very good at this. And, you know, it meant that maybe got in with the wrong people. It got into some trouble as they were growing up. But that became their narrative of just like, you know, I've always been a bit of a troublemaker, really. But it was actually part of that was that they had undiagnosed ADHD and they weren't getting their needs met.
Yeah. I think this jigsaw puzzle of different presentations where, you know, we talk about mental health, or we talk about behaviour, or we talk about neurodivergence. It's becoming clearer that there are different presentations that people have that maybe have been missed, which further on down the line causes difficulty. It's not an excuse for domestic abuse or domestic violence, but it does sometimes. It doesn't, it doesn't admonish it, but it sometimes it explains it, and sometimes I think that's the work with perpetrators to help them understand their own behaviour and to help them with strategies to change, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. It helps if they can bring more awareness to how their brains work and how they are and their past, because, you know, it's never going to, we're very much sure it's on the programme as well, it's not an excuse whether there's a mental health problem as part of that or a bad childhood themselves. That was very common that people have witnessed abuse themselves or been through trauma. And none of this is an excuse, but it forms a really important part of the picture. That kind of needs some unraveling and some kind of work, because working with men particularly as well, they've often not been shown how to kind of talk about emotions in that way, so they hadn't been able to do the processing of some of those things, certainly not in a group with other men. I mean, watching that for me was quite powerful. I always thought what a gift this was to be able to sit in a group with men talking about emotions, some of them who'd never talked in that way before ever, and the modelling for each other. You know, group work is very powerful in that sense for them, but it just meant that they could build a real understanding. Sometimes people would come to us and just say, this is one thing that just happened just once and that was it. There's never been any problems before that. And then actually, as we start on a program, which is largely psychoeducational, but lots of like CBT and other stuff in there as well, then it would be actually, there were problems for many years before. They just didn't have awareness of that. And it builds the picture of actually thinking about their own attachment styles and insecurities, their own past. The jealousy was a big one in it as well. And all of these big cocktail of things that basically led them to needing to use the behaviours that they've been using. And once they've got a better understanding of that for a lot of them, then that meant that they've got more chance of changing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us back to the point really of it's important to work with perpetrators as well as victims and survivors, because that's the way that change is facilitated, no matter how uncomfortable it may be for some people to think about that perception. You know, that's you know, probably where a lot of the good work can be done, the prevention side of it. Now, you explore many types of domestic abuse in the lecture: physical, financial, spiritual. You touch on coercive control. Which do you feel remains the most misunderstood or overlooked in therapy?
I think in the lecture I focus a little bit more on coercive control, because I think that it's just more, it can hide more easily. It's more subtle, it can be more subtle, more insidious, but the harm is still great. So on the programme we would always, we would be teaching about what domestic abuse is as well. And we would have to dispel a lot of narratives or minimisation around physical abuse being the worst, because that's what people do. And I know anyone working in domestic abuse has probably always been like, it's not just just physical abuse. It's actually all the other stuff around it. It's going to be, and coercive control is usually the underpinning of that. And it can be harder to prove. It can be harder for a victim survivor to understand that that's what it is, because it makes them blame themselves or think that they're the crazy one. You know, gaslighting is that it's all part of the thing that makes them doubt themselves and not leave. So I think that's why I focus more on coercive control, but then that also led to lead to more about stalking and harassment, again, because that's something that I find often isn't in domestic abuse awareness trainings when I've done them, and I think that comes up more than people think, because it's only 2 unwanted contact attempts that make harassment, and a lot more people have that, I think, than they know. In this way, I do find that both victim survivors and perpetrators will use what we call minimization, denial, and blame, and it's all part of, I guess, not feeling those horrible feelings that you don't want to feel, not feeling shame, and just making it livable, really, for both parties. But it does mean that there's a lot of it's about the subtle pattern of behavior. So coercive control is more about the pattern through the relationship or through various relationships. And that's why I felt it was really important to focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think sometimes it is minimized, isn't it? The fact that there's no violence is, well, you know, there's no violence being put towards you. It's just hurty words. But actually, you know, a prolonged engagement with someone who's gaslighting or is being verbally abusive can really destroy someone's self-confidence to the point that they're physically unwell and unable to function. And you did touch on attempts to leave. And in the lecture, you say it takes an average of 7 attempts before a woman leaves for good. I wonder what therapists can do to support a client across those multiple attempts without sort of pushing them or pathologizing them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really tricky, because somebody will only really want to leave when they're ready to leave, and obviously telling someone to leave is not part of what we do, and it's probably not going to work anyway. So people, I suppose, victims are trying to keep themselves safe, and when someone leaves a relationship, the risk actually goes up. It gets more dangerous for them potentially, because there's a risk of stalking, because the risk of stalking actually can lead to a homicide risk, which is what I cover in the homicide timeline. So, and I think that even without knowing those sorts of words, people are trying to keep themselves safe in relationships and know that it will get worse. The fear of leaving is sometimes worse than the fear of staying. So it's a case of people maybe want to leave the relationship and they've decided that they do, and they know they may have people might be at all different stages with this, isn't there? There's the stages of blaming themselves and not wanting to leave. They're still not wanting to leave for various reasons, thinking that the person will change, thinking that it's their fault. And then there's maybe a realization that I don't want to be in this relationship and these behaviors aren't okay, but then still not being able to leave because they need to feel safe. So they're trying to work out a safety strategy. Victims know their perpetrators better than anybody else, and they know how to tiptoe around them and to keep themselves safe. It sounds strange, doesn't it? But they kind of know how to do that because they know the perpetrator well. So they're going to be looking for an out there, and what they need is, that's where a domestic abuse specialist, like a hotline, which I've got in my lecture, I've got various sort of places to sign point. So as counsellors, I think it's important that we know our sort of limits with that, really. I know that I've been because I've worked in this, I've got to be careful not to go into a different sort of role that is a domestic abuse. Maybe someone like an IDVA, who is an independent domestic abuse advisor. Those sorts of roles are the people who help with the practicalities of getting out of relationships. They're the ones who know the legal system more than we would as counsellors. They're the ones who know housing systems and finances, and they do all the practical stuff. And I guess we've just got to keep in our role as therapists, which is, to be there as the emotional support for them to work through these emotions if they're at a stage where they can do that. to be honest, that's a survival. It's going to be a survival point, isn't it? So usually when I work with people, I'm working with people who've been in abusive relationships in the past, and it might have been years before, but that's actually where I think that's more where the therapeutic work can be done. It's more the holding space and the survival space when they're trying to get out of the relationship. Probably the processing of it comes a bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of practical things here as well, isn't there? There's children, housing, where someone's going to, the work. And I think it's interesting you touch on the work of Jane Monckton Smith and what's called the homicide timeline. And it seems very paradoxical, doesn't it, that when someone leaves a abusive relationship, they may very well be at more risk. So we have to be thoughtful about that. And Jane Monckton Smith has produced a framework for kind of escalation. It's in the lecture. Just very briefly, how can counsellors use this framework to maybe enhance safeguarding or therapeutic interventions?
Well, it's a framework that I guess was partly designed to be a risk assessment tool for people working in domestic abuse. But for me personally, I found it more generally a good theory, especially reading her book, In Control, because it's a book about domestic homicides, but it's actually about coercive control. So that's the book, I would say, that it had a huge impact on me when I was learning about this, to help me understand coercive control, stalking, and how this can escalate. So it can be used I suppose the homicide timeline can be used as a practical tool. When we're on the program, we were having regular risk assessments and things that we would talk about where this person might be in that stage, and if we've noticed a change in behaviour, because that would be the clinching bit of the homicide timeline. So I guess I should just say briefly that, because this might sound a bit random that we're talking about it with people going, what actually is this? So it's an eight stage homicide timeline. Goes from where there's been coercive control in the relationship, stalking, harassment, various different behaviours, that then ends in a perpetrator killing their victim. And because Jane Monckton Smith's work looked at so many women that have been, I think it was mainly women that have been killed by male partners, and saw that he said 94% or something had stalking involved in it before. So they thought there's something in this. And the way that I like this personally is more of a societal basis really than an individual basis of, I guess it's not just societal, it's about our work as well. What can we be all doing to recognise when stalking and coercive control is there? Because we could actually prevent a death. Not everybody, it's not always going to go to, I mean, we saw people in the program kind of go up and down the 8 stages, and we'd think, is this a risk? The relationship's ended. Are they using stalking behaviours? Is this escalating? And the change in thinking that comes is a bit of a moment where they just go, if I can't live without her, then she's not going to live effectively. So we could use it as a practical tool for looking at changing behaviours as we go. But I think as an overall theory as well, it's helpful to bring more awareness to stalking and coercive control, and what we can do as a society to be able to recognise those to prevent further harm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very useful tool that you put into the lecture. I'm aware that we've been talking about women survivors and victims. I use the term interchangeably because people may see themselves interchangeably in this. But the fact of the matter is, of course, there are men who are victims of domestic abuse. But I'm going to guess, I've not got the figures in front of me, I'm going to guess that the figures are a lot lower than for women. And maybe that's because they're not as reported as much, or one train of thought is that men are more violent than women. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, yeah, this is a complicated one, and I guess I wanted to kind of I tried to kind of touch on this and cover this in the lecture, because I think all of these things exist. And then I think that the nuance of it is that it can exist together. And for me, learning about domestic abuse, I came into it from quite a feminist angle. And some of the theories and workings on domestic abuse are from feminist literature and feminist theories. So on the perpetrators program I worked on, based on the Duluth model, comes from feminist theories. And the reason that that's done is people would say, well, why are the perpetrator programs for men? Because the research is showing that there's more male perpetrators than there are women. And actually, if there was endless money and funding, we'd probably make perpetrator programs for other people as well, because it's not that it doesn't exist. It's just that those are what the figures, and there's very limited funding when it comes to perpetrator programs anyway. So they're focused on where the biggest numbers are. For me personally, yeah, I absolutely think there are a lot of male victims, and the stigma of coming forward is more is difficult. There are female perpetrators. It's difficult for them to know where to go, because I worked with female perpetrators, but we did it on a one-to-one basis, because we can't just throw them into the program full of men on a program that's designed for men. So it led to adaptations of it, really. And so I just started adapting, and that's when I started learning a lot more as well, because I thought, I can't base this on my usual theories. So it was a very useful point in my learning where I started learning about female perpetrators. Took me into learning more about LGBT plus perpetrators and different types of relationships. So it really blew it all open for me. And so I started reading some of the research and got involved with people who in the LGBT plus domestic abuse world. And then I ended up on a steering group, and we designed an LGBT plus perpetrator program, which I think is the first dedicated one without just a few adaptations. So the work is there, and I felt very, very privileged to be part of creating an LGBT plus, because otherwise it's not that it's not happening. It's not that domestic abuse isn't happening in different kinds of relationships. It's that it's either there's more stigma and it's more difficult to come forward about it, or they just don't know where to go. And with LGBT plus people, I think when you're faced with a service that is the man's the perpetrator, the woman's, and it's all binaries, male, female, victim, perpetrator, they don't really know where to go. So actually, there was this good discussions that we used to have in this steering group of there was a theory that they were going to have counselling instead, and not actually going to have domestic abuse specialists, because they didn't know where to go. So they would look for probably somewhere dedicated in the counselling world, but it wasn't necessarily dedicated to domestic abuse. So I think that got me thinking that's really important as well, especially working with LGBT plus people, in that they might not feel there's a space for them in domestic abuse services. So in this sense, I think that anybody can be a perpetrator or a victim, and also perpetrators have been victims as well. So the more I learned about this, the more complex it got, and I think that I was wanting to bring these complexities in. I am someone who very much wants to talk about male violence and gender-based violence, especially with the rise of online misogyny, red pill movements and things. And I think that's really important to talk about, but I want to be able to do that in a way that doesn't take it away from women, LGBT plus people, other people in other kinds of relationships, because it doesn't mean that there's no problems there. So I'm trying to I guess this is where I'm kind of trying to open up a kind of nuanced conversation of, we need to be able to talk about all these things and hold all these things at once. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you touched on the LGBTQ plus community, because as you've rightly identified, services tend to be binary, and services for them are sometimes little, maybe as you say, non-existent or a little confusing. What can therapists do to make their practices more inclusive and responsive to LGBTQ plus clients?
I mean, I think that's more kind of general beyond domestic abuse, isn't it? I suppose that's more kind of doing your CPD and your reading and stuff on that generally to understand the experiences of people, of LGBT plus people across the spectrum of people and genders as well. And I can only really speak on my own experience here, is that if you're on social media and use it quite a lot, following people's stories, that's the main way that I've learned about people. If I want to learn more about trans people, I will follow people who are active in the trans rights community or just sharing their own personal journeys of that. And for me, that's been the most powerful way of learning about it. But there's also some great books on CPD out there as well.
Yeah, I think that's a clear message. I like that message of it's not just about domestic violence, it's about building and accepting and an inclusive practice in every aspect of your work, not just in this particular aspect. Now, this is a very comprehensive lecture. It's one of the most comprehensive that I've ever read through and listened to. If there's one thing that you think that those people who listen to this lecture should take away, what is it?
Oh, that's so hard because there isn't. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to bend the rules on this and go with a couple of things. I'm sorry. I suppose also to just build on what I was just saying with LGBT plus communities and domestic abuse as well. Part of the lecture has got an intersectionality wheel in it and thinking about power and privilege. So domestic abuse is always about power and control. And so learning about intersectionality is an extension of all of this, and power and privilege is going to be really important. So that's kind of, I guess, a bit of the last question, but also part of this one of what I would want people to take away. That we need to be looking at domestic abuse in more of an intersectional way, I think. We need to be having nuanced conversations around it's not just men. It's not just men and women. It's not just heterosexual relationships. But simultaneously, there is an issue in our society, probably born out of various gender roles and expectations, where sometimes men can have a tendency towards violence, and that's really important to explore as well. And lastly, just don't be afraid of doing this work if you think you want to, because I think that's what we mentioned earlier of like people being maybe a bit afraid to do this work. It's amazing work. It's absolutely amazing, and sometimes I found it harder working with victims and survivors for me personally, because I feel quite powerless for them. You can really feel quite powerless in that. And working with perpetrators, I mean, it wasn't technically therapy, but it was a therapeutic intervention on a perpetrator program. But I saw people's lives change, and I saw the ripple effect of it. And I saw them come in and say, like, my kids say that I'm acting differently now. They've noticed that of me. My partner says that she's no longer as scared of me. And it's the ripple effect that this has. So it's actually really, it's maybe not as difficult work as people think. It actually can be very, it can be very satisfying in that sense. It can be very, very rewarding. But I'd also say that doing that work is really needed within a held environment as well. So I was working within a domestic abuse charity. I wouldn't do perpetrator work just solely as a person. You need all the risk management and team, dedicated specialist supervision, and everything around it as well. So I suppose I just want to leave people feeling a little bit inspired as well, whether they want to do this work or not. I think just also recognising the importance of that in the whole world of domestic abuse and beyond.
Well, if our conversation has sparked reflection or raised a question in your own practice, I encourage you to explore Mel's full lecture, Domestic Abuse Awareness, which is now available in the Counselling Tutor CPD library. Just a reminder that the 24-hour National Domestic Abuse Helpline here in the UK, there'll be helplines in different sections of the world, but here in the UK is 0808 20 00 247, 0808 2000 247, and we'll put that link into the show notes of the podcast so that people will be able to see that if you or someone you know needs any support. And it just remains for me to say, Mel Ciavucco, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you as always to Mel, our guest, and to you, Rory, for holding that all-important discussion. Rory's already mentioned there is a CPD lecture on this. And just to say, I think it's £67.99 at the time of this recording to get access to that entire lecture. But you don't just get that entire lecture. You also get hundreds and hundreds of other lectures. You get access to our air quotes Netflix, because we're not Netflix, but it's kind of on-demand lectures in the Counsellor CPD library. Just go to counsellingtutor.com for that one. We now move into student services. We see you, students, on your formal journey to become counsellors, psychotherapists. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting, and it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counsellingskillsacademy.com. And certainly here in the UK, Rory, there is a level 3 certificate in counselling skills. But if you look at any counselling training that is worth its salt, there's going to be a year that really just focuses down. So the level 3 is a year, if not a bit more. But there is a focus on counselling skills for a full year where you're doing some theory, of course, alongside that. But the main focus is honing and getting those skills correct. And I guess it's the why. What's this all about, Rory?
Well, it's a good question to ask, and I thank you for asking it, Ken. And before I go on to answer it, just for our Scottish listeners, we've got a lot of listeners in Scotland. There may be some confusion over level 3. So in Scotland, the qualification levels are different because it's a different country. So we will for the purpose of this, we will call it a certificate in counselling, and that would cover the English experience, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, before I get any letters in the post box, and our listeners in Scotland. So why is this important? Well, I always think the certificate in counselling is wrongly labelled. If I'm honest, it should be a certificate in advanced relational dynamics, because what happens is, yes, you've got the curriculum, and you look at the curriculum, you're going to do some skills, you're going to do some personal development, and you're going to look at theories and quality and diversity. But really, what you're doing is you're developing a skill set of communication, of wholesome, I'm going to use the word wholesome communication, a way of communicating with people in a way that sees their view of the world. How often do we communicate to respond, not to understand? If you say something to someone, they'll usually give you a solution, as opposed to saying, that sounds really, really difficult. You'd tell me a bit more about that. And if we're only listening to respond, then we're never going to have high quality relationships with those people who we communicate with. If we listen to understand and understand that person's frame of reference, then we will almost certainly have better quality relationships in our lives. It doesn't matter if you're thinking of being a therapist, or it's at work, or it's in your outside life. By listening to understand, you will have a better understanding of what people are communicating to you. And the way that's done is by developing a suite of counselling skills, which is something that's never taught at school. Although, to be fair, they are doing more of this in schools, I believe. But as I say, it gives you a suite of skills that you can use and try out with your peers and develop this enhanced way of communicating with people. That's the best way I could describe it, Ken.
I like it. I love how you've used enhance communication skills. And I'm recognizing that when I covered this part of my training, it was such an eye-opener for me. It was such a life changer for me that it became my special interest and passion. You know, I wrote Basic Counselling Skills, a student guide, which has sold thousands and thousands of copies throughout the world. It's all about counselling skills. And as you say, Rory, those advanced communication skills. And of course, I built Counselling Skills Academy because I know the importance of skills and practicing skills and understanding skills to be confident and competent in them. But the reason that I'm so locked in to this is because it is advanced communication. And as a very proudly autistic man, I look back on my earlier years, and the most difficult thing for me right through schooling, being a teenager, going out to clubs, meeting people, was small talk communication. I don't do it well. I don't do it well because it kind of sometimes comes with the territory of neurodivergence, not always, of course, but it does in my case. I struggle to have small talk with people. And when I did the advanced communication skills, I'm going to call it, when I did my counseling skills, I started learning how to interact, how to listen. I didn't know because, like you say, Rory, it's never taught. And it changed everything. Because, I mean, counseling skills, when we're learning them, they have a very specific reason. We're going to take them into the therapy room and we're going to use our counseling skills there with our empathy, our unconditional positive regard, and we're going to create that therapeutic environment. But I found that I could take just the skills themselves, reflection, active listening, and slight mirroring, and I could just use it in my everyday interactions. I suddenly had a set of rules that I could apply, and now I don't have a challenge with that small talk because I realized that within that small talk, I just need to listen. I just need to reflect back what they are saying, and generally the other person will lead the way and walk away going, wow, what a great conversation artist that person is. And the truth is, Rory, I can say very little in the conversation, but it feels more natural and more of a flow. And I think this is quite an interesting element to the counselling skills because many that learn counselling skills don't go on to become a counsellor or a psychotherapist.
No.
And you may think, oh, what a waste of all that year of study. It is not, because those advanced communication skills, they're going to set you up in any place in your life where you have to have interactions with other human beings. It really is as simple as that. And it gives you a set of rules that works. And we know it works because the theory and the research underpins it and shows that it works, Rory.
It is. And if you tie that in with the theories that you train in, I mean, most of person-centered work of Carl Rogers using empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. And let's be honest, it doesn't matter if you're doing person-centered or you're doing transactional analysis or all the plethora of new therapies that have sprung up in the last 20 years. The basis is the relationship. The evidence is absolutely clear. Talked about Lambert's pie before, the research that's been done to say what has the best outcomes of therapeutic relationships. And by a great degree, the relationship is the biggest part of it. And the relationship, developing a relationship, is unlocked by enhanced communication. I always like to think of it, Ken, as having a set of skeleton keys. Usually you're given a set of keys to communicate when you're a child, and they only unlock certain doors. And you wonder why you can't get on with other people. And it's because you haven't understood how to unlock that door of communication. And that's what you get. You get develop a bigger set of keys to unlock doors to communication. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I've trained radiologists, I've trained police officers, I've trained paramedics, I've trained doctors, I've trained CEOs. I had a CEO who wanted to learn communication skills. Personal trainers. I've trained a lot of personal trainers who wanted to have better communication skills. Forensic examiners, believe it or not, someone who went on to be someone who's a forensic examiner, and not all of them went on to become therapists. They took that set of keys, if you like, and those enhanced skills, and went on and used them in their own work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting, looking at them. So we know the use of them, we know the value of them, not just within the therapy room, but outside of the therapy room as well. And I think the most important skill of counseling skills, and this is my view on it, is the actual active listening part. Because if you're actively listening and you learn how to actively listen, you naturally will be a better communicator. Because if I go back to what I was suggesting before, where I was saying, I didn't have those rules for communication. When somebody was speaking to me, all I was thinking of is, what are you supposed to say to this? How am I supposed to respond to this? What's the right thing that I can say in this situation? So I wasn't actively listening. And if you're not listening to the person in the first place, well, then it kind of half of the communication is gone before you even start. And just by becoming quiet, not thinking, what am I going to say next? And using the active listening skills that you will learn again and again and again in counseling, you are already a better communicator. And that's before you say a single word. Before you even open your mouth, you are a better communicator, just in how you hold your body, where your eyes are at the time, and the fact that you really are listening. Not sitting looking like you're listening by leaning forward a little bit, but you actually really are listening. And the next skill that I think is really interesting for me, and again transferable out of the therapy room, is just the skill of silence. When a person finished a sentence, I thought that the rule was, okay, it's like turn taking, that's my go, I've got to jump in and I've got to say something now. So if you said, I've got a cat and it's got a tail, I might say, well, yes, that's interesting. I've got a dog. In fact, I've got 3 dogs, and between them, they've got 3 tails. I've got to think of something to put in here, as opposed to just silence and maybe a minimal encourager like a, and how effective that is. If you leave a little bit of silence, here's the thing. If you leave a little bit of silence when someone is speaking to you, they say more. Generally, that's my experience in that as well. So it's so interesting to me that without opening my mouth, I became a better communicator. And then by putting in reflection, paraphrasing, and selective use of good questioning, it obviously takes it to another level. And I'm speaking outside of the therapy room now, but of course, as counseling students, we are, of course, looking at the skills for therapy as well. And this is the thing, the skills that we focus on are so rare that when a client comes in and experiences that along with the congruence and the empathy and the unconditional positive regard that we will provide for them, it is powerful. It is powerful within that room, even if we don't say that much. And of course, as you become more competent and confident with the skills, you'll use them without thinking too much because you've been actively listening, and it almost feels natural rather than I wonder which skill I should pop in when they've said that, Rory.
Yeah. It becomes less of kind of a rather kind of rehearsed conversation where you drop this skill in and that skill in, and more of a fluid communication. And it served me very well. I was I don't like the dentist. I think I probably spoke about this in the podcast before. And I was in the dentist, and I was speaking to someone who looked really wet. And I just said to them, I said, you look wet. And she said, yes, I'm a bit out of sorts. And I said, what happened? I didn't say what's wrong. I just said, what happened? And we had a lovely conversation about how she slipped coming to the dentist and she got covered in wet. And it was a lovely, lovely, human communication. It was value free. It was just me and someone else having a chat about an unfortunate tumble that she'd had on her way to the dentist, and we parted company. And I was more kind of invigorated by the conversation. I can't speak for her, but she looked very happy that someone had taken the time just to speak with her. And it can make such a difference in her life. I think that's what I'm coming to. Having a conversation where you're listening first and talking secondly, and you're trying to really understand the person in front of you, can be a revelation and make such a difference in a life. And if you can make such a difference in a life, that's a great thing, isn't it? If you do that every day, think how good the world would be.
Oh, yes. I like it. So if you're listening to this and you are a student, there's the value of those skills. They hold value outside of just counselling and psychotherapy, but they hold immense value in counselling and psychotherapy if used. If you study them and use them well and effectively. With what we've discussed together, some resources. Number one, go to counsellingtutor.com. Here's a tip. This is a really good tip. On the Counselling Tutor website, we've worked for the last year on something quite secret. In the background, we've been building out a super duper search engine. It's an academically overviewed search engine on counselling and psychotherapy terms. So if you go to counsellingtutor.com, on the top bar, just click on the little hourglass, the search icon, and type in any skill. Put in silence, metaphor, anything you like, active listening, and you will automatically be presented with a load of academic resources that have been checked, that are referenceable. They've got references of where they came from, so you're able to reference them for your assignments and stuff like that. And it's all free, not a single penny. Just go and use that. And you can use it for theory. You can use it for any counselling term. Secondly, I mentioned the textbook, which is available from Counselling Tutor. You can get it on Amazon. You can also get it on Audible. It's Basic Counselling Skills, a Student Guide. There's the Counselling Skills Academy if you wanted to get together with peers and study skills together and do online triad work. So there are some resources for you. And of course, for members of our student library, we have got an extensive skills resource in the skills library, covering all of the skills in very deep dives. We're talking 40 minutes to an hour-long lectures just on one skill. What it looks like, what it does for the counsellor, what it does for the client. It's absolutely a very, very, very valuable resource. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com, click on our products and just look for our student library. It is all there for you. And I guess that leads me to say, Rory, that this has been episode 346 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Beautifully communicated, Ken. And we started off with ethical, sustainable practice. We came across a new term, or maybe a new for some of us, triangulation and trauma, how that works and how we link to working with clients who find themselves in a triangulation situation. In Practice Matters, an interview with Mel Ciavucco talking about a CPD lecture in our CPD library titled Domestic Abuse Awareness. It's a fantastic piece of work. And I think anybody should be watching it. It really, really is good. She's an excellent lecturer. And then in student services, we touched on advanced communication skills, the certificate in counselling skills, and what it prepares you for and how it will change the way that you communicate forever. As always, thank you for your likes, subscribes, and shares. And until the next time, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.